happy to have you all with us today. And the first question I would like to ask you is how did contributing to open source libraries had an impact on your career, both externally and internally? And how did it influence your career path and skill development over time? So,
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's definitely, I mean, it has a huge impact on my career. It's basically my career, and it's what allowed me to do work that's very visible. Because I think often if you work in tech and work in companies, you can do a lot of work, but, you never get to share it. So for me, it was really, doing open source, I was able, um, yeah, to build stuff also for people to use. And yeah, it's kind of a cornerstone of what I do.
When I started, I was a PhD student in physics, and so with the impact it had, the first impact it has, this has completely changed my life. Went from physics to computer science, and also, of course, it gave me a much broader impact. But maybe the most important is it got me to learn many things. I often joke, but it's not completely a joke, that I started scikit-learn. I didn't know machine learning, and it got me to meet a huge amount of great people.
I can only add to what has been said. Probably the tiny thing I would add is it is a formidable accelerator, um, both in terms of career, but in terms of relationships, in terms of knowledge, and in terms also, I would say, of self-discovery. Okay, what is it you want to do? And you get to try things. You get to be around people that are hopefully way smarter than you are. Um, so it is very much a great, I would say, accelerator both for yourself and the career as well.
That's
At
really
least it was for
interesting.
me.
I guess it's the what most people are seeking through open source projects, especially in contributing. Um, I think you mentioned all of you about the learning opportunity that open source has, either coming from a complete different field, but also like to increase your skills on something that you already know and try to keep up to date on these skills. So we would have this question for like building skills through open source, especially for developers looking to grow their expertise. What specific skills can they gain from contributing to open source projects that they might not acquire through traditional industry company roles? That's a tough one.
Well, one of them is collaboration. We collaborate in a different way, and I guess it's more of a bilateral collaboration. And so, at least I can talk for scikit-learn. For scikit-learn, there's a lot of consensus building, which I think is a very useful skill to have. And then, you might, if you go on in other roles, for instance, in the industry, I think that typically makes you a better leader inside a company.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think it's also like understanding a larger code base, because often, when you're contributing, you're not writing something from scratch. Like, it has to fit in contextually, and that means, okay, you have to be able to, trace maybe a bug all the way through the software, and also actually debugging as well. I think that's something that's maybe not always traditionally taught, but like, how to figure out where the problem is, how to fix it, how to write tests. And I think that also makes you a better developer, because if you're using other people's code and something goes wrong, you can actually diagnose it, and you're not like stuck at an error message and that's it.
Interesting.
Yeah, I would add again, I agree
Next
100%.
time you get to start.
Yeah. Yeah, the collaboration thing is definitely probably the most important thing, and also the spread of knowledge and people you get to directly access is very hard to find, I would say, in a regular company setting, unless you are at very big companies. Um, on Monday you can go very deep into some very niche subject, and on Tuesday some others, and find experts and find people. I would say probably you are passionate about it, because there's a reason you start open source in the first place. So maybe it is the thing on top. right? Because a lot of people are here because they like it, not because it's their job.
Okay,
Some of us are lucky enough to do both, right?
we'll get to that at some point. I think that's a very interesting point. You all three of you have this experience, both like as a maintainer, but also as a business leveraging open source projects. So when talking about open source project and open source development, there is this core challenge about how to keep it alive, how to maintain it, and how to scale it at some point as well. It's not business objectives. Sometimes it's mostly about knowledge or having something that is up to a certain use case. And on this maintaining and scaling challenges, did you face some type of? Did you have some key experiences that you could share with us today on you face like obstacles and how you overcome those challenges in I don't know, like scaling a given project or leveraging the community to maybe like act on a certain point of the lifetime of an open source project. Maybe it links to actually the your point of view, your company point of view on open source projects.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think it's also important to distinguish between like different types of open source projects. People talk about open source, but I think there's kind of the more classic one that people think about is, okay, someone just wrote some code, like I wrote some code and I want to share it with others. And then there's kind of the more collaborative approach, which is let's build something together. And then there's maybe the more commercial approach, which is we made a product and it's free. And I think these all come with different implications for the maintainers and also for the community. Like if you're building something together, then there's a high expectation from the community and high agency. Whereas if you're building a free product, you are telling people, hey, I built this and you should use it, and your company and you should rely on this in production. I mean, that's what we did with Spacey. We basically said, hey, here's a product, you should use it. And then that comes with also responsibility from our end, because if you tell people to rely on your software, if there's a bug, you need to fix it. And you can't then just turn around and like point to the community and be like, oh, other people should build my product. And I think this is important to distinguish between because it means very different things. And for example, in our case, yes, we're building a free product and we're getting benefits for it, and people can contribute, but we expect that we have to be responsible for the software. And it represents Spacey in particular, it represents essentially one person's take, my co-founder Matt's take on how people should do NLP, and that's like opinionated, and I think there are some opinionated aspects of it that made it a successful project, but that also makes it inherently hard to contribute to, because there's all the history, there's all the opinionatedness. So that actually probably for us was one of the bigger challenges when we grew our team and tried to get more people involved in contributing.
Interesting.
I can, and also maybe to add on that, like I would say the age-old question of open source is how to tap. It's like the $1 trillion question of what is the value created by open source versus how much of that value is actually grabbed by companies to build it more, right? Sadly, there's no single answer. It really is case by case. There's a graveyard of products that have been put by open source, like companies going open source because that was the way for them to grow, but they ultimately couldn't find a way to turn that back into money, right? And it's like there's a plethora of reasons of why that is. Sadly, there's no single answer to that. If there was, the world would be a different place. But it is very much a thing. I think also a reason why we do this is not always like as some sort of like strategy to grow. But I'm very bullish on, especially in infrastructure and everything that essentially gathers us together today, is if you want to be taken seriously, you got to go open source. And there's many more ways, to turn that maybe into money later. But it is very much a thing, and I wish at least 1% of the value that was created by open source would go back to open source. Maybe one day we'll get there, and a lot of people are trying.
Actually, the value capture, that's another good point,
Yes.
because it's, I think if you do open source, you kind of accept that like you will always provide more value than you can capture. That's just how it is. But I think
Absolutely.
we also it was definitely challenging for us to see, okay,
That's
how
why
can
it
we
works.
how
Yeah.
can we capture, we've probably created so much value. If you look at all the companies using our software, like how can we capture that? And I think, some people's takes on this, or like naive instincts, are not actually what works. And I think, yes, you can turn successful open source projects into money, maybe, but often, it does not work that way. Just because a lot of
Absolutely.
people use your software doesn't mean that they should give you money, or
Absolutely.
that you can make money. Like usually that means product decisions on top of that, and that's quite independent from open source.
Absolutely, and I would add to this that maybe in the last 10 or so years, open source went from, we started to see open source in the 90s, 2000s, early 2010s as infrastructure, building blocks, but probably in the 2010s, we started to see open source products.
Yeah.
And there was a shift. And for these types of, I would say technologies and products, capturing a bit of that value, even though it started as something that was ultimately self-sacrificing in some way, is a matter of just survival. Because at the end of the day, the bank doesn't take licenses as collateral, right? So maybe there's an answer to that, by the way. As long as GitHub stars, let's say, are not a currency, we'll get to turn back. But I'm kind of sad that only such a tiny fraction of the value created is goes back to the people who actually made it happen in the first place.
And so, like, we've seen it's a very actual topic in the open source community, because there have been several large projects, well-known projects, which have recently taken measures to try to get back some of that money, either by aggressively defending IP, like WordPress recently, or changing their license to a more restrictive license that doesn't fit the open source definition, like, for instance, forbids some forms of commercial utilization. What do you think about these approaches, especially the alternative licenses?
Well, so the dream of open source is the dream of commons, right? We share things because we share things, we're stronger. There's also the classic tragedy of commons, because the thing is shared, nobody cares about. So I'm not going to have an answer. Well, I mean, I can have an answer to your question on those tenses, more or less aggressive. They typically lead to failure. I'm not coming on the WordPress thing, because it's a rather
Other kind of forms.
yeah, and it's a rather specific thing. And we've seen these things before, right? OpenOffice, LibreOffice, right? Which is also with the resilience of open source, right? Okay, trademark issue. Well, you just rename the thing. I mean, this has happened many, many times. No, the question is, okay, open source, it's actually a fairly technical term. It's related to open source licenses as defined by the Open Source Initiative. That's not really what matters for the economy of open source. What matters for the economy of open source is that there is a cause that is shared and used by many. And now, of course, how do we make this sustainable? I don't know, but I just want to stress that open source is one, in the sense that every single digital thing that we do has open source in it, and sometimes a lot. And even, the company that used to be completely anti-open source, because open source was a cancer that was, killing software, Microsoft is using it everywhere. But the problem is that our digital economy is based on abusing the user, whether the user is an end user and we're just basically playing with the user, grabbing his or her data and then selling it to others, or whether the user is a company and then we're getting lock-in systems. So, we have a pretty big problem. I don't think we have a sane and probably not long-term sustainable digital economy.
Yeah, also I think to add to that point, I do think it's also important to stress that, like, I don't actually, people often think that companies and people use open source because it's free. And I actually disagree with that. I think there are a lot of other reasons why people like open source, and one of them is, for example, the no login. You can fork you can program with it. It's modular, it's flexible. You have a community around it. There's so many reasons, and I don't think the fact that it's free, it's kind of a nice bonus. It helps with adoption. It helps with getting started. But I do think generally, also even companies are like they are willing to pay for things if it adds value. It's more about, like, I think it puts like open source maintainers in this position where you have to ask yourself, well, what's my value prop? And we've definitely seen in the past, also as you mentioned, like that just I host it for you isn't necessarily a successful and sustainable value proposition, because then, well, anyone can host it. And or it's like this old saying of like, well, if a cloud provider can just easily offer it, then it's a bad business model. And I think that's also kind of what is behind a lot of these license changes and a lot of these experiments that we're seeing.
Okay. I mean, I get why they're doing what they're doing. I'm thinking of Elastic, Redis, the WordPress. It's too early for me to comment, but the thing is, I mean, we don't. First of all, we don't know what the real story is. But what I can say is, probably, I don't want to, I don't know what the inside story is. But one thing that we've seen over and over again was, let's just put everything free, and we'll figure it out later. And then, in the case of Elastic, Amazon comes in and says, "Thank you, we'll make the money." And so that strategy backfires and gets probably, I would say Amazon was maybe not the good guy here. Maybe Elastic was too naive. Who knows? But the thing is, that strategy indeed in that case backfired. Maybe it was because of abuse, maybe whatever it was. And so there are, if Amazon is able to charge for it, there's a market for it. So how do we, make that, probably, I don't know, maybe make better licenses or models or whatever. Sometimes it's very subtle. One thing I am not so keen on is walking back on your word.
Okay.
If you say it's free and then you're like, oh, sorry, I mean, you can't do that, obviously, right? If it's a matter of survival, you'll do it for sure. But maybe, we've seen these movies, and maybe we're entering a place in which we'll be, at least I know I will be too careful about, walking back on your word, right? And what is the clear line between what you give away and what you charge for also?
Yeah, and I think that's also maybe for those people who are considering going into open source or building a business around it. I think these are questions that ideally you should ask yourself before you start, and
Absolutely.
in the beginning. And because this idea of like, oh, I'm just making a project and then I'll tell people to use it, it's going to be successful, and then I somehow can raise money or figure out a business. I think that is where you hit these problems.
But this also raises a point you raised, which is there a way we can capture, so I wouldn't say value, but the money in a way that is, or I'd say that has tailwind with the experience. Hosted, whatever, it may be like a trump card, but sometimes it feels a bit off, right? It's like pass. It's like, all right, okay, you charge me for your engineering, which I can do still, right? So it is also about figuring out where can we, extract the money, where it makes the most sense, and where people are, willing to pay because it makes the most sense, and it doesn't feel off, as in we're just going to do the SaaS version, which sometimes feels a bit,
So there's another way, which is the slow way, the way of the 90s, let's say, the business model behind Linux, which is to say, we're going to have so many users, and it's going to be so central to so many companies that those companies, out of survival for themselves, will contribute. Not a fraction of them, but they'll contribute. So basically, it's not one company behind the thing; it's 1,000 companies. companies. It's 1,000 companies either employing people. Look at where the Linux developers are employed. They're employed in many different places, or contributing money. I think this is a virtuous model. The question is how to get it to work. And of course, it will be very unfair because you'll have some people leeching out, some free riders.
I think the first one there are models that are working, right? VLC comes to mind. Video Labs, the company behind VLC. The question is, the first one, or I would say the future I hope to see, which is the first one that gets it to scale enterprise grade revenue, will change the face of open source forever, because it's going to be, the one company that managed to do it in a way that goes very, very high, that gets to get very high revenue.
I mean, I don't even know if I would see it that way, because again, ultimately, then it's just a product, and it's just building a business, and you initially got the attention through open source, but like how once you're at enterprise, well, you're selling something.
So what I mean is like enterprise scale.
Yeah.
Like you get enterprise level, what people consider to be enterprise level revenue, so that people are like, oh man, you're doing the thing that we didn't think was possible.
Did Red Hat not do this?
It's a complicated subject, which I will not go into. Red Hat, I love you guys, but
I mean, I guess
good point. Good point.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I could comment on another thing that we found not very appealing, or that has problems. Like another typical model is support, or like helping people with the software. And that does seem, in the beginning, I think it can be nice to do some consulting. Like people, it's a great way to get started. That's also what we did. Initially, people will reach out, are like, hey, you've clearly built this. Can you build something for me? And that's also why I think, sharing how you did things is actually beneficial. People are not going to just use your tutorial and then leave. They're actually going to be like, oh, great, you clearly know what you're doing. Can you do it for me? So in the beginning, I think that's great. But very quickly, I think it introduces misaligned incentives for your open source project, because you do want it to have great docs. You want it to be easy to get started. But then if your business model is helping people get set up with your software, you kind of have to make sure that your docs are not too good, because then people don't need your help and you have no business. But then if your docs are shit, people are not going to adopt your project. And I think that could very, very quickly
can turn sour sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, an adjacent thing which we've also done is doing more of an SLA. Companies are, if they decide to build and not buy, as in use open source software internally instead of just buying a solution, that is worth something for them. And it's very important to them to know that this project will continue to be maintained, and that if there is a bug or security vulnerability or whatever, that it will be fixed, which normally if you do open source professionally, you'll do anyways. And so companies are willing to pay for that, and they're willing to pay for that with very, very little active work in return.
What would you think? So something that companies always ask for, especially big companies, is to support old versions of Python, things like this. What would you think of doing this support, but only paid for? Developers always hate doing this, right? We like to move forward and not support old versions of Python.
Yeah.
So should we do that?
So what do you mean? So companies
you'd have a fork, or rather a branch of the project that's a private one that supports the old versions. Basically,
LTS, yeah.
I mean, I guess it also depends on what you normally do. I mean, we tend to always, we still support versions that are close to end of life or even past that, because.
Yeah, we do that too.
What's the latest? What's the oldest you support?
I think we support Python 3.9.
We still have 3.8, I think.
Yeah.
You guys have 3?
Well, I mean, for I don't know, when I finally was able to stop using Python 2, for years I was I had to write code Python 2 compatible, or when I see new features coming out in the programming language, I'm like, oh, cool, maybe in 5 years I actually get to use them in my code base.
That's an interesting point. How do you think maybe there is a way that companies or open source project can be a dynamic help for companies to not have this old version anymore, to keep them up to date? Is there this?
It's because they have internal processes that are
Okay.
not right. When you have internal processes that are not right, you're terribly scared of changing anything because you know you don't have your proper testing and quality assurance at large. So
Yeah,
that's their problem. We can't fix
there's
it.
challenges
Well, I mean,
that
then
are
you in
open.
consulting territory again, where
Yeah. But the thing is, like, change for a lot of them is as infinite, can be an infinite well of problems. And
Okay,
so you don't know, like in very complex system, it's like Jenga, you don't know what you're going to break.
Mm.
Even though for the sake of it, it sounds cool to update.
yeah.
Everybody wants to, but it's a long process. But this, very much has value too.
Yeah.
Right. Everybody wants to, but um, it can be it can turn into very, very expensive, not from a labor perspective, but more from like, oh shit, we broke that perspective.
Mm.
And the higher the stakes, I would say the stronger the headwind is to
Yeah.
change, which is understandable, right?
Yeah, this reminds me of this well-known meme where you have the whole internet coming from this single
Oh,
piece
yeah.
of open source code
maintained by like some guy in
in the
Finland.
Alaska. Yeah, exactly. So,
Sometimes you don't want to know. You sleep way better at night if you don't know. Right?
So, I mean, some point I want to raise is that I find that the tech world, like any industrial world, is probably unconsciously doing a lot of planned obsolescence, right? Planned obsolescence is when basically I'm selling you a light bulb, but I'm basically building it in a way that it fails too fast. I'm selling you a washing machine, and in a few years I'm going to remove the parts out. So, yeah.
I mean, on one end, I'm a sucker for new things, whatever they are. I guess if we're engineers, that's also one of the reasons we're engineers. Progress is a way forward, and we want to be at. And by the way,
Progress is not a way forward. Sorry, I'm going to get in my things, but sorry, I'm going to get political. But have you watched pictures of women in Afghanistan 40 years ago? Compare it to their life today?
yeah.
No. Progress is a complicated thing.
So the question becomes, how wide is your lens? How far are you looking back? And how far will you be looking into the future? Because if
Well,
we
we
look
all
back,
live-
2,000 years, 10,000 years,
We all
can-
live, 100 years old, not much more. So,
No,
that's what
I agree
matters
with
to
you.
people.
I agree with you. But
Without going to that 100 years in the future,
if you have children, you are looking into 100 years in the future.
let's
for
say
sure.
500 years in the future.
They'll have children too.
Let me ask my question. Damn. Now, just to we've been talking about open source project in the whole tech industry, in the whole internet basically. But as we are today mainly about AI topics and the boom of Gen AI, as we have been hearing in the introduction of .ai, has really put the spotlight again on a lot of existing projects from the previous era of AI. Now that we have so much attention on this open source project that has been here for years, and that it has been also very pivotal in the evolution that we are currently seeing. How do you see this landscape of open source in the future years? Is there any trends in the place of open source in the future of AI that you see will be changing compared to what you have seen before?
So one point I want to raise, because you're talking about Gen AI, is that open source is changing its meaning, of course, but also one of the things we care about in open source is to avoid capture. Gen AI is creating another kind of capture, which is the capture to the compute, whether it's the hardware or the amount. You can't scale a Gen AI business unless you're into a very large cloud. And so basically the very large cloud is reaping the benefits from your Gen AI business.
Okay, yeah.
And so those are actually the same actors who are vastly investing in and developing the technology. So we're talking about open source. One of the reasons we're into open source is to limit the capture. So we need to think about technology at large when we think about capture.
Also, I mean, Gen AI also kind of tends to reinvent a lot of previously existing concepts or introduce new terms, you have routing agents, and we used to call that a text classifier, and there are a lot of these, and one of them is actually also, I would say, open source, because people talk about open source models and what this can mean a lot of things. And I think this kind of this nice like website that tracks all models that are available and what's actually open, and like just uploading your binary model weights to somewhere, is that open source? I don't know. So it kind of
So
is
this creates a new paradigm of open source stuff, because it brings also these new challenges that it's not really what we think about open source.
So open source, if you go back to the roots of the movement, it was like, it's not about being free. Don't give me a compiled code, because the compiled code, I can't use it, I can't modify it. So right now we have open source models that are, you can't build them. You don't know what data went in, you don't know what code was used there. By the notion of open source, they're not open source.
And even if you do, like, you can have a model which has open weights, open code, and even an open data set. But the data set itself is synthetic data, and you don't know how it's generated. So it's the whole rabbit hole. And I don't know many truly open models where you can track the provenance of the data and have the license on it. It's very hard.
Also because I think a lot of people are not really interested in even revealing where all the data comes from, because
of course, are you kidding? Of course. Nobody cares. Let's be honest, nobody cares.
Yeah.
I mean,
people care a lot.
No, I know, but the
Nobody
people
cares
training,
sharing.
they don't care.
No, I mean, I've been in these discussions. The people training, so first they care, but then second, they don't want to talk about it for liability reasons.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, but ultimately, the way forward is nobody in that business, nobody has a moat, ultimately. There's so much data. There is what we're seeing today is that what you buy is compute. That's it. Okay. So nobody has a moat. The way forward is open source. And it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and a lot of companies are starting to see it. On the inference side, it's now super clear. This is the reason we exist in the first place too. On the training side, there are a few technical things, but interconnect being probably the most important one. But data, of course, but models are converging unless there's a leap in architecture. For now, I would say, I'm very bullish on open source. So far, history has proven us right.
And we're rich.
Give us 15 days. But yeah, this is the way forward. And even like from probably a political perspective too, do you want, something that could become very core to your everyday existence, as Jan says, could mediate a lot of our interaction to be, essentially closed. What I mean closed, I don't mean, unable to inspect what happens inside it, right? I just mean like owned and operated by somebody who don't know what's behind the closed doors.
Yeah, actually, that raises a good point, because I actually once I did a whole talk on like why I'm bullish on open source and why I think AI will not be monopolized, because yes, we're talking about economies of scale, and yeah, you kind of have to use API providers, but there are other ways. Like for example, yes, LLM and big tech companies are trying to tell you that all you need is just a bigger and bigger model that conveniently they host for you, but that's not actually true. And I think there are a lot of other ways to use the technology. But I do think one big risk, and there we're back to the political, is bad regulation. Because we have one problem, I think, that a lot of prominent actors in the field are doing is they're trying to conflate AI products with AI technology. And that's why, people talk about AI and then people think of ChatGPT. But there's also the models, and those models are software components. But in a lot of the narratives, very conveniently, this becomes one thing. And so if we're talking about regulation, we have big tech leaders talking about AI safety and talking about how the technology is so dangerous, and pointing to the products and including the technology as well. And so if we are not careful, and if we get swayed by these arguments, or Sam Altman talking in front of Congress. That's not the goal. That's not because they're legitimately worried about things and want good regulation. It's because they want the monopoly, and having the government says so is an awesome monopoly to have. And if we let that include software in general and not products and use cases and things humans are doing with the technology, then we really have a problem.
It's actually more complex than dishonesty, by the way. It's this very complicated situation where people are going to savior mode, thinking that what they do is so incredibly powerful, which is also related to people thinking about their self-importance, I'm sorry to say, which is also related to fundraising and bubble and thinking, claiming that you need, I don't remember how much gazillion dollars to build new chips and new nuclear power plants and everything. And then once they, if they've gone completely pop in their head, then they also start thinking, oh, I also must, make sure that the future of humanity is right. So
I do think there's also much more strategic objective there, and which is regulation. If you're a big company and you can influence regulation, you have the monopoly.
I'm government advisor, so I know this very well. I can see it on a very regular basis. But what I'm trying to tell you is that you have many actors, maybe not all of them, many actors who believe their message, which makes it even more difficult to refute. I don't believe them. And those actors are manipulated, sometimes by themselves, by their own interests, sometimes by other people's interests. But those people believe their message. It's hard.
Sure, but I'm also saying that we shouldn't just kind of ignore it or think, it's just people and their egos. Like there is also...
we can't ignore it. It's the powers that are in action are just ridiculous. They're huge.
No, but imagine, that we end up with regulation that, I don't know, throws all of AI
we were
models...
that close at some point.
Where AI models is just like one thing instead of AI applications. And that's kind of the end of the open source ecosystem as we know it.
And that's the goal.
But I think, to be honest, I don't know, maybe I'm an optimist, but to me, the cat is out of the bag. So it's not coming back. It's not going back in. And the second thing would be in which you know better for sure, but these things are happening. What I would say irritates me a bit is seeing them wrapped into morality arguments. Like Apple versus EU type of thing, the regular, whatever. These are not, whatever happens is not for morality reason. This is for interest reason. This is a power play. And, and it happens every single day all around us. Let us not, be taken back by the fictional story of through morality or whatever. Just realize it for what it is, which is a power struggle. And
this is not how it works, right? This is, all power struggle works in society. They work via narratives.
I know. This is why I'm here saying to all of us, right?
Yeah. So the tech world, especially, the people who are more coders,
we like drama.
Yeah, but maybe people don't realize, the power of narratives. But if you look at societies, I could talk about Afghan women's or bikers being killed cyclers being killed in the streets of Paris or things like this. They're all shaped by narratives.
Very true.
Maybe, guys, before we take some questions from the audience, you talked a lot about open source. Well, open source is kind of a product. I mean, the tools we've been building are products mostly because they're used by users. And we were wondering as well, as companies and users, developers using open source products, how can I contribute back? Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. How, as developers using open source products, how can we contribute back, give feedback, and also advocate for open source to remain an industry standard and something that will remain in the long run?
I would say first thing is use it. Well, try it, use it, contribute.
Advertise when you're using it. That's really important. Back to narratives. We don't exist. I mean, I've had very large banks tell me, oh, we're using, scikit-learn to do credit for detection, and we have this problem. Oh, really great. Let's try to fix this problem. Can you advertise it? No.
Yeah, but also I think share your use cases, because that's also why I like going to conferences, because normally as a maintainer, all you see is bug reports, and yes, you have a rough sense, there are people using your software, but actually going to conferences, I talk to so many developers who are like, oh, I work at this company, we happily use Spacey and we're doing this, and I would never otherwise find out about it. And, actually going to conference was very valuable. We ended up, started publishing more case studies, which then other users find super valuable because it addresses their questions. Yeah.
And then back to my, my dream of community-driven open source done by many people in many companies. Give some free time to your developers, and that can be a hiring argument. Actually, you will hire great people, and it requires management also, because you think about, you need to discuss with them about their own goals while contributing to open source. But I think this is really creating the right virtuous system, because then you're also influencing what happens in open source. You're making sure it's good for you, so it's a win-win situation. That's my favorite story. If you want to, if you can't do this, then you might want throw some money at different organizations that are behind open source. That's the third way.
Okay.
So we were mainly talking about like contributing to open source project and then sell yourself like in interviews, like I'm contributing to this project, but the company can also advertise itself in the other way.
So Michelin is a French company doing tires. Michelin just launched a big open source thing that, basically Michelin believes in open source, and Michelin is helping open source by giving money to foundations.
Okay.
But also at the same time, don't do open source just for the sake of open source. Like we also see that sometimes you have a company, they're like, look, we're doing open source. And I'm like, what is this? Like, what?
Michelin is contributing back.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wasn't like commenting on that, but I think people might see this and get the idea, oh, we need to do open source. That's like saying, oh, we need to
Open
chatbot.
washing.
Yeah.
Open
that's
washing. Oh, it's really a thing. Companies are open washing. Wow.
Of course.
Incredible. After you, though.
Thank you so much. Maybe we can take some questions from the audience. Does anyone have a question, maybe? Or we can... oui, vas-y. J'ai pas le micro. Sorry.
Can you hear me well? Yeah? Okay. So you have a question, maybe? Yeah? One question from the audience.
So a question for Ines. If it's like not big monolithic models, how many models run? Like at the end of the day, what's the cardinality of the number of models that actually run?
You mean in companies or like how?
On Earth.
Oh no.
On Earth, like in 5 years from now, if we don't lose, like if you guys win, it probably means a lot of really small models.
Yeah. I mean,
So
already.
how many of them are running?
I mean,
What's the
already we
cardinality?
see like so many models being trained in companies, and it's like I don't even know the number, but like imagine if we have a good workflow system and good tooling, like developers can train, I don't know, several models a week, and then you can kind of extrapolate from there, and every team can have their own models, or maybe at some point in the future as users. If we, there's more talk about on-device models, and I'm seeing a lot of cool work there. Maybe as users, we can all have our own model in our browser that's like specifically trained for us, and then we can have all the new AI features without giving away our data. Like this, every person, can have multiple models, and there's no limit, and all with even less compute than we otherwise would need.
Our own computer, our own data,
on
our
our
own
laptop.
model. Is there any other question in the audience? And then we will. Yeah,
It's
no,
not
go ahead.
exactly a question, but for me, every time I engage with a new open source project, the first thing I do is fix a documentation mistake.
Yeah.
And I think
that's a good tip for our
yeah,
audience.
I think that's
Thank
a
you very
great
much.
way to start the relationship. And it also, because it's really starting a relationship, it's not just one-sided, because I see how the maintainers react to this, right? So it gives me a sense of who I'm interacting with as well. So I think it's a very easy way to get started.
And
That's a great idea.
Documentation is really up to date.
Also a great tip for people who may be new to development, and maybe it's easy to be overwhelmed by like a complex code base with like years of history. But if you really want to contribute, looking at the docs, that's a great Wait.
On that, I
But,
think GitHub implements, well, GitHub and maybe other providers, there is this GitHub first issue. Having a first issue, like issues that you tag as quite easy for new maintainers.
But I would say, in a more probably general thing, is you enter a community. It's the better way to enter a community is with a gift,
Okay, well,
whatever it is. Right.
I think we could not have the perfect ending on this talk. Give to the community, and community will basically give back to you. So I think we can close it here. We had a very interesting talk. We went
Thank
into
you.
much details on this open source world, and that was really interesting. Thank you so much for your inputs. Thank you to the audience for your questions as well. Thank you to the chat, and I hope it was really nice for you as well as it was for us. Have a nice afternoon at the first day of .ai, and we'll see you same place tomorrow, same hour, with a multi-model models experts. So yeah, have a nice day at .ai. Thank you very much.
Thank you.